გამარჯობა კიდევ ერთხელ პატივცემულო მაყურებლებო, ჩვენი გადაცემის მეორე ნაწილში ეს არის ექსპერიმენტალური ფორმატი, რომელიც შოთამ მოიგონა და მე მხარი აუვი, რათა მივცეთ რეაქცია იმ მოვლენებს, რომლებიც მიმდინარეობს ჩვენს გარშემო და დასახელებაც კი ჯერჯერობით ექსპერიმენტალურია, შეიძლება მერე შევცვალოთ, როგორც ეს თქვი გადაცემის დასაწყისში, რათა ერიზე თავდებოდეს, როგორც ჩვენ გვიყვარს, როგორც სოსო მანჯავიძის გადაცემა, გონიერი, ამიერი, მიერი და ასე შემდეგ. მინდა რომ გავაგრძელოთ ჩვენს ძვირფას სტუმართან ერთად, ალბათ არ იქნება გადამეტება თუ ვიტყვი რომ ეს კაცი არის ფართო ქართული ეროვნული საზოგადოების საყვარელი ამერიკელი, ეს გახლავთ მსოფლიოს საოჯახო კონგრესის პრეზიდენტი, ბატონი ბრაუნი, ძალიან ცნობილი პიროვნება ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების კონსერვატიულ წრეებში, რესპუბლიკურ პარტიაში. ჩვენთვის თავარია, რომ ის არის შეყვარებული საქართველოზე, არის ჩვენი დიდი მეგობარი, ვისაც არ გინახავთ, შეგიძლიათ YouTube-ზე ნახოთ ბრაიან ბრაუნის სიტყვა რუსთაველზე, როცა ჩვენ ტრადიციულ ღირებულებებს ვიცავდით, როგორ დაგვიდგა ის გვერდში არ შეეშინდა არაფრის და ჩაიგდო თავი მორიგ საფრთხეში. ბრაიანი არის ნამდვილი გმირი, იმიტომ რომ იცავს ტრადიციულ ოჯახურ ფასეულობებს მგლის ხახაში. და ამის გამო არის მუდმივი შეტევების, ასე ვთქვათ, ობიექტი, მაგრამ ამ კაცს არაფერი არ აშინებს, არის ჩვენთვის განსაკუთრებულად სასიხარულო, რომ არის რეგბისტი, მორაგბე და არის 9 შვილის მამა, ღრმად მორწმუნე ქრისტიანი, არ არის მართლმადიდებელი, არის კათოლიკე და ჩემი პირადი მეგობარი და როგორც კი გაუჩნდება ხოლმე საშუალება, მიუხედავად მისი კოლოსალური, ასე ვთქვათ, დაკავებულობისა, ჩამოდის საქართველოში, გვეხმარება, გვიდგას გვერდში. ჩემი ნატრაა, რომ ბრაიანი იყოს ამერიკის ელჩი საქართველოში. და არაერთხელ მას გაუწევია დახმარება, მისი კოლეგები და ყოფილი თანამშრომლები ტრამპის შტაბის ხელმძღვანელები იყვნენ წინა საარჩევნო კამპანიაში. ბრაიანს აქვს დამთავრებული კემბრიჯის უნივერსიტეტი და არის ისტორიის მეცნიერებათა დოქტორი. მისი ინტერესის ფოკუსი არის 19 საუკუნის პირველი ნახევარის დიდი ბრიტანეთის ისტორია და არის გრანდმოაზროვნე ინტელექტუალი, განსწავლული ფილოსოფიაში, გეოპოლიტიკაში და ისტორიაში და ერთი ჯიგარი კაცია, რომელთან ერთადაც ურთიერთობას, მეგობრობას, ნადირობას, მოგზაურობას არაფერი არ ჯობია. ამ რამდენიმე წლის წინ სანამ ავად გამხდებოდი, ძალიან დიდი პატივი დამდოდა სიუზანი თავისი მეუღლე და თავისი 9 ულამაზესი შვილი ჩამოგვიყვანა სტუმრად კიკეთში და ბავშვებმა მაგრად გაიხარეს ერთად და ძალიან ვხარობ, რომ თბილისშია თავის ბავარიელ, ასეთივე საინტერესო ბავარიელ გერმანელ მეგობართან ერთად, რომელიც ასევე სტუმრობს ჩვენ სამშობლოს და დღეს მოვიწვიეთ სტუდიაში, რათა ვისაუბროთ. Brian, welcome, wonderful to have you in Georgia, in Eri Media, in Bagration, and looking forward to this conversation with you. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn something new from you, and I never get enough of it, so a rare privilege. I'd like to start, and maybe we can keep this as fluent and liquid and informal as it fits our friendship, if you don't mind. And I would propose that I ask you questions that interest me and our part of society vis-a-vis the United States, and be glad to answer whatever questions you may have with regards to Georgia. My first question would be, based on the outsider's view, it looks like all is clear in the Republican primaries, and anything God forbid, short of a bullet, I'd be very surprised if it's not Trump who comes up at the top. When we spoke a year and a half ago, the picture was somehow different. Ron DeSantis seemed to have a higher percentage of probability. It is that Ron DeSantis whose personal aide wrote a critical article about me and called upon the collective West to stop me up until it's too late. And it was very curious and coincidental that I got ill shortly after that letter. I hope it's just a coincidence in her case. But back to Trump, do we read this right? Is he likely to be the nominee? And what does this mean for the upcoming U.S. elections, presidential elections?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. Being in Georgia is like breathing free and fresh air again. I don't know that people realize, looking from the outside, how difficult the situation has gotten in the United States for conservatives. And you read the press and you see that Donald Trump has been indicted again, and it's happened so many times, people have gotten used to it. Well, we shouldn't get used to it. Indicting a former president is something that throughout our history we've refused to do, because we know that what it becomes and what it can become is, first of all, absolutely dividing the country, and second of all, using the power of the state to punish political opponents. And unfortunately, that's where we're at right now. The 18 other folks indicted in this Georgia case under basically a RICO law that was created to go after the mob. This is political persecution, and I never really thought I would see it in the United States. So I lead with that because understanding Trump's great lead in the polls has directly flows from this, because while many folks may have disagreed about Trump's style or disagreed about...
It's really the style, isn't it? Anything other than anything else.
The one thing that even people who are uncomfortable with that sort of in-your-face New York style and the language, everything else that people may be critical of, at the end of the day, they see him as someone who is standing up against
the swamp.
Yeah, everything that has gone wrong. He may not be exactly what they would have chosen, but he's one of the only ones that was willing to take it all on. And so these indictments raise his profile even more, because anyone rational looking at this can realize that they hate him, and they're doing everything in their power to take him down.
So why are they doing this? I'm assuming the liberals are anything but dumb when it comes to tactics. Yeah. They are dumb when it comes to big picture. But so why are they doing things that are boosting his rating?
Well, everything that they attempted to do in the media, all of the lies, all of the attacks, which, by the way, didn't start on Trump. Remember early on when we ran the marriage amendments to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman, we had the first taste of true modern political violence, where the LGBT groups were starting to send, for example, white powder. I had death threats, other people involved. This wasn't just run-of-the-mill political posturing. This was serious. People's property vandalized, some people actually physically attacked simply for standing up for traditional marriage. So that background then led to the point where we have Antifa going after anyone that disagrees with them. We had a summer of burning buildings down and nothing happened to the folks doing it.
The summer of love.
And then we get to this point where the media has thrown everything at him, and he still has this very high percentage of approval by Republicans. Again, the hearings in Congress, the the January 6thers being put in jail for 15 to 22 years when, and again, I don't support what they did. The question is, you put them in jail for 15 to 22 years when rapists get less. You're trying to make a political example now. So my point is simply that having used every mechanism possible in the media, in law, in entertainment, the beginnings of political violence, everything they did didn't work. So I believe that we're on a potentially a course of a train wreck, because those things didn't work. The ante keeps getting put higher and higher, more and more and more, and I think they're quite willing to throw him in jail.
I was going to ask, without getting into the nitty-gritties of the mechanics of the indictment and the peculiarities of the American judicial system, which would be a bit hard given the format of our podcast to explain to the listeners. Just let me ask you, a simple peasant language question. Is there a chance for him to be thrown in jail before the election or not?
Yes, there is a chance. There is a chance. There is a chance that he could be convicted. Perhaps they don't put him in jail. They just convict him, and then you have then there'll be a forced constitutional crisis to try and claim, since he's convicted, to make up the law to say you can't become president. And then we're on a real. That's why I say it's a train wreck, because rational people will say, you're clearly, all you're doing is trying to make sure that he doesn't have a chance to get into the White House, and you're using every mechanism, including the law, to stop it. And they will, come rally around their side. The rest of the country, those that realize what's going on, will rally around their side, and who knows what will happen. I don't know what will happen. So, in politics, a lot of times you can be right or wrong, and so you'll say, well, Trump could be the nominee. That's very likely, but Ron DeSantis is coming up, and that's a possibility too. Rarely is it indeterminate. So what I'm saying here is that because everything didn't work, they're pushing this to a conflict that is indeterminate, because it's better to have that than to have what's happened before, which is Trump keeps gaining in the polls. One of the polls just a day ago was showing him 1 point ahead of Biden. So even with everything that's gone on. So I think that the paradox here is that all of the attacks are not meant to necessarily only have someone else be the primary candidate, win the Republican primary. The attacks are to go all the way to the end, to potentially to have him convicted, and to then make an argument that he can't run at all.
My last Trump question would be, when I was standing the ground I was standing for all these years, the only reason I felt relatively safe was that I abstained from entering what you would call practical politics. And my dad, bless his soul, used to say, don't let him in to politics, he used to say to all my friends, because they'll kill him immediately. And before I made the step in 2021, Nino, my wife, asked me to do a medical checkup, and I was completely healthy. And a week later, I announced that I'm entering politics with the aim of building and consolidating anti-liberal, anti-globalist, conservative part of Georgia. And I fell ill with 2 simultaneous lethal illnesses, which are caused by radiational poisoning, and went through the lethal diagnosis and 24 courses of chemo, and it's a miracle that I'm sitting and talking to you here. So I speak out of very bitter experience, and not a single blip of investigation or anything was done by those forces who don't want Christian conservative values to be heard anywhere in the world, let alone in a place like Georgia. So given the imminent threat that he poses, given that he has already been a president, given that they know that he's coming like a train which is unstoppable, would you agree with me that he could, God forbid, die a sudden death, fall ill? And is that in your sort of experience and system of coordinates and analysis, is it something that you worry about or not?
Oh, I do worry about it. Remember, I mean, we've already had presidents with assassinations and assassination attempts, and Ronald Reagan being shot right outside of a hotel. He does have very, you know, they do have very tight security around him, but the level of violent discourse is so high. So I do worry about it. I think that the fact that he, you know, that he's been protected for so long, that's very good, but the threat of political violence in the United States has never been higher. They've had someone outside of one of the Supreme Court justices' home with a gun. Increasingly are even, you know, lower level than the president. Politicians have to have 24-hour protection. This is a different world. So yeah, I worry about it. But you know, again, there's not much that we can do. It's something to be concerned about. You know, what those of us who support President Trump, again, I would vote for many of the other primary candidates, not all of them. The great irony on this issue with Christina Pushaw is that Ron DeSantis has been one of the strongest voices against the transgender agenda, the LGBT movement. So that's a little, it's very troubling that he's getting advice for someone that clearly doesn't understand, not to go to, you know, not to embarrass you, but I mean, to understand your importance in Georgian politics and what you've done to lead, I believe, a silent majority here. I mean, my friendship with you goes way back, and you and I have been through a number of things together, and you know, we've, as you know, my family and everyone I know, when you were ill, we've been praying for you and trying to publicize the reality that you were targeted, you were poisoned, and to yell this from the rooftops to people who didn't want to hear it. But, you know, having been through all of that, it's still it's frustrating to realize that what we're trying to build, which is a global network of people that understand the threat from global liberalism and that are willing to stand up against it, that always the bigger threat is within our own ranks when someone like Christina Pushaw writes this article and undermines our ability to have these friendships with lies. And so I think that's a problem. However, Ron DeSantis has done a great job as governor of Florida. I worry about, because of that and other instances, what he would do on the geopolitical front. But remember, even with Trump, he tried, and there were some good things. Don't fly the rainbow flag over our embassies. So that's much better than we had before. But many ambassadors stayed the same. They weren't changed. My hope here is that if he gets through all this and he's able to have a free, fair election and he wins, that he's seen more than anyone what our opponents are willing to do. And he will realize that what we truly need is a clearing of house. At the State Department, we can't have people around the world undermining America by going out there and making it seem like all Americans support this LGBT agenda. This undermines America. It does the exact opposite of what people claim. So I think that you will see a much more aggressive President Trump in a second term. So I hope for that. It's a long way to that. We'll see. Again, I think it's indeterminate as far as how far they push using the law to throw him in jail and convict him. So that's the real, what happens then? That's the real question.
While we're on DeSantis, if I were to analyze as an amateur outsider non-American, but someone who loves American culture, studied there, knows it, etc. If I were to analyze the reasons for, let's call it, DeSantis' demise in the face of Trump in recent 12 months, in my shallow analysis, it would consist of two major factors. One is he just cannot beat Trump. So his demise is in the presence of Trump, because of the presence of Trump. In his absence, he would be much higher up. And the second factor would be these accusations I hear, Trump notwithstanding, of his connectedness to the globalists and the deep state. And Christina Pusho, in my analysis, would be one of the first symptoms of that. So I want to focus on that second factor and ask you, what is the most sort of commonly cited proof of that, which people throw towards DeSantis while accusing that he's part of the puppet masters and the deep state?
Well, I'm not all that familiar with attacks on Ron DeSantis or that being a major factor in his decline, meaning as governor, he has not had a lot of interaction on the foreign policy front, so you don't have a long history here. We have this instance of Christina Pushaw, and in this case, part of me thinks that because of her history, she simply has misunderstood. She's not against us on the LGBT or transgender issues. If you go and look at her Twitter feed, she regularly speaks up about this. She just, in my view, has a profound misunderstanding and is on the wrong side when it comes to Georgian politics, and has made a massive blunder in her interpretation of you. It's wrong. Now, that's me being charitable. I hope that that's the case. I try and be charitable. Maybe that's not the case, but I still would say that it's worth taking effort to have discussions with those around Ron DeSantis, potentially Ron DeSantis himself, to say that there's a concern that if you got into power, you would treat people that are leaders on our side as enemies, and we can't have that. So, I don't see that as the major factor. I think that the major factor is simply that the more that they have gone after Trump, the more that they have skipped over all of our political norms, which, by the way, there's a great book on the fall of Rome called Mortal Republic that talks about the first step to the breakdown of the Republic was that things that were unwritten, the political norms that guided people's lives, that stopped politicians from going too far. They were not even necessarily written, but they were all just understood. That once those started breaking down, then you get to breakdown of law. Those are the political norms are broken down. Those are gone. So now we're using the law. So I think that is the issue. The issue is that because they have been so willing to break down the political norms and the law itself in their attack on Trump, that people have rallied around him, and there was already a lot of support. The other fundamental truth is in primaries where one person has a huge appeal, even if that candidate also has massive negatives, when you divide up the rest of the vote by having 6 or 7 candidates, inevitably you're going to have an issue where no one else can win, and that was always going to be an issue here. What's interesting here is that his lead is so large over the next viable contender, so that is interesting. So can things change? Yes, we have a somewhat strange and unique system of primaries starting in certain states, and what happens in those states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, that can help change things, but I don't see a very realistic path for another candidate right now. Again, could certain things happen? Yes, but those things are so far outside of what I believe is right. For example, him President Trump being thrown in jail, convicted, or God forbid something worse happening. That I think that I think right now we have to predict a Trump winning the primaries, and then the question becomes, I think this is in some ways the more interesting question: is Biden the nominee for the Democrats? We don't ask that question too much. There is a lot of worry and concern on the other side about Joe Biden's age, and Kamala Harris is not a great candidate. We all know that. So I am somewhat concerned that Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who is an uber liberal, he was the one that in 2007, 2008, unilaterally started issuing so-called same-sex marriage licenses in San Francisco with no legal authority. He just did it on his own. He is extreme. So the other part about Gavin Newsom is he's a good candidate. You know, we can look at someone and say, evil, horrible, don't agree with anything, but you also have to have the, you know, the perspective to be willing to say, but they're a good candidate. Obama was a good candidate. Apart from anything else, he was very good on the stump. He was very good in his speeches, and Gavin Newsom would be too. So there's a lot of discussion. Many political prognosticators whose whole life is prediction and guessing and talking have talked about the potential here. Democrats are trying to say it's not real because they don't want any opening, any window where people think this is a possibility that President Biden isn't the nominee. But I wouldn't discount that. So that also would change the equation a bit, who the candidate is. And if Gavin Newsom is president, God help the United States. He is as extreme as it gets.
Like I said, don't let me dominate this in one direction, and feel free to flip the table anytime you want and ask me whatever questions you'd like. But while we're on the subject, let me make one reflective comment, and that is that aging of elites normally is, for those who like to read history, and you're a professional historian, is a direct symptom of a dying civilization or a dying system. And it so happens that when we were younger than now, we witnessed that vividly in the aging of Politburo and fading it away after Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov, sort of one after the other. And it's very representative and reminiscent somehow of what we see in terms of the aging of the US elites, the absence of social lifts, nepotism. Your singers get wrinkled from decade to decade. They can no longer sing, but they dominate the stage. Your Hollywood actors, your family clans no longer allow newcomers in, and very little. So it's a sad picture of an overall decay. And in that regard, let me ask you this. Is it true that given the state of America's foreign debt, that the processes have gone so far out of hand, and the war is so necessary to keep the industrial military complex going, to keep the power of US dollar omnipresent around the globe, to enforce it as a reserve currency, that it doesn't really matter vis-a-vis, for example, the Ukrainian war, who wins your elections. Whoever wins, Trump says he'll end it in a day, but can he really? Or is he, because, when Obama became a president, American foreign debt was 10 trillion. When he left the office, it was 20 trillion. So one president borrowed as much as all the previous presidents that you had before him. And then Trump didn't do much better either. When he left the office, your debt reached 25, I think, trillion, and now it's hitting 33 trillion. So it's an awful, terrifying pyramid which is looming upon us, all of us, by the way, and dictating, what happens in your foreign policies included. So let's call a spade a spade. Does it really matter for us? And for our region and for Russo-Ukrainian war, who wins your elections, or nah, it's gonna just go to its apocalyptic end.
Well, we may find one of the rare occasions that we're in disagreement on this one. I do think it matters. I think it matters a lot. I don't think we're at sort of late stage. We're not at a point where there is no way to vastly improve the situation. If a clock is too far ahead, you turn it back. You can't necessarily do that with country. But there are ways to make things better. And some genies get out of a box and they create a situation that transforms a country and makes it so that country can't be. There's certain things that it can't go back to. I think that's a reasonable argument. But I also think that, given what we saw, for example, with Trump, in the first, when he was elected, no one thought that would happen. It wasn't predictable. It wasn't orchestrated by puppeteers on the world stage. It was a real event that happened through in an unpredictable way for much of the world. But if you'd been looking at the United States and seeing, as I've said every time I try and come, that don't let the elites that come here and try and run your country, please don't judge all of us by that. And we ask for forgiveness that our fellow Americans are so, what they're doing is so evil. To come, to tell you how to live, to put the rainbow flag over a State Department, to lead the Pride Parade, all of the things they do, that doesn't represent us. And Middle America still doesn't represent them. Have we lost something? Yeah, we've lost something. That's the truth. That in the sense, the reality is that there has been a continued push to transform American views on marriage, family, and life. And there's been, a decrease in support for traditional marriage as we've seen the state use its power. The state has coercive power. Once it puts the lie of same-sex marriage into the law, of course it's going to have a power in affecting people's minds. But there's been a significant pushback on the other side too, especially with the transgender agenda and everything else. So let me loop back to the original question. I think that who is next president can have a very big impact on what happens in this region, what happens as far as our foreign policy and geopolitics. I'm not a professional historian. I thought I was going to be when I was studying, but I instead was blessed to be able to be involved in fights with you and others around the world on life and family. But one thing I always rejected was what's called the Whig view of history, the notion that history is determined by outside impersonal forces and that we can read from the past what will happen in the future almost like a machine. That is not, in my view, the way history works. Men and women rise up in ways that go against whatever the dominant paradigm is, whether it's in the medieval period or in the Roman Republic or in the ancient period, and new things occur. And especially with the incarnation, with Christianity, there is always the hope that that men and women, a leader, a group of people will stand up for truth in the face of evil, and that will be a light to others. I still believe that there is imprinted on every man's soul some light, some image of what truth is, and you can only push. I mean, I don't believe that you can that a lie can't last for a long time. It can last for a long time. But I feel like we're at a point right now where the conflict is heading in such a direction that people are going to have to choose if they're going to stand for the truth or they're going to capitulate. And I think that a leader that changes policies, and frankly, even I had questions, talking to my wife about Donald Trump initially, but I determined, as many people did, that he's who I would vote for. And I was pleasantly surprised with some of the changes he made. I mean, changing our Supreme Court so that we overturned Roe versus Wade. Many of us thought that would never happen in our lifetime. So you can say, well, so many other bad things have happened, Brian. But yeah, that's true. But when you say, looking at our past, that Roe v. Wade would never be overturned and we would have abortion on demand throughout America, and that only a crazy person would say that Trump, one person, would be able to change it, you were wrong if you said that. So there's a number of things that did happen that were very good that give me hope that more fundamental changes can occur. Now, if we have a Gavin Newsom or a second Biden term, I don't know. I don't know how, it becomes increasingly difficult to sort of claw ourselves out of this pit the longer this goes on.
We just had a ridiculous briefing 2 days ago by the representative of Georgian intelligence who said foreign powers, wink wink, we're not going to say who, are planning an overthrow of government in Georgia. He went ahead and named names of people, called them terrorists, and said they work for the, among other things, for the Ukrainian government. And then he said, we wanted the public to know. Now, normally under the basic logic of at least modernity, before modern absurd chaos we live in, if a country's intelligence comes out and says we have a governmental overthrow coming, after such an announcement you'd certainly have some arrests of people suspected in the act of terrorism. And here we have nothing. We don't even have cancellation of legal rights of the non-governmental organizations who were named as participants in this terrorist act. And so the society is yet again bewildered by what happened. And in a way, it's not news to anyone who is thinking politics in Georgia, because this has been in the air ever since the Ukrainian war started. The new incoming ambassador, Danigan, I forget what her first name is a specialist in color revolutions. That's like her acclaimed speciality. Here is the question, assuming there are no surprises and they really want to do it, why? Because if they succeed, let's say they have another yet, I don't know, I lost count, I'm told 82, they had 82 government overthrows, US State Department since World War II around the globe. So let's say they have a number 83 here. And let's say they install some Saakashvili type maniacs, Russophobes, who immediately cause us to go to war with Russia, open second front. With all due respect to our men and our warriors, Georgia is not Ukraine in terms of the sheer size, quantity. It's not going to take much from the Russians, like we've seen in 2008, to just steamroll us over, and they lose the country. So why are they doing this? If they are instigating the color revolution, they're basically voting for losing the presence in the country. And then, depending on the scenario, how it pans out, you could see either the pictures that like those in the airport of Kabul or some other type of withdrawal, but they'll be kicked out, right? So what is their logic? Or do they have no logic? Are they just out there as pyromaniacs to cause as many fires around Russia as they can, and I don't care who burns down in those fires?
Well, you know your region much better than I do, so I'm going to...
But you know the logic of Americans more than I do. So.
Well, sometimes I think I do, and sometimes not, because sometimes it doesn't appear that there is a logic. You know, you speak to people, you know my own views, that while I focus on life and family, I have my own views on neoconservatism and what it is and what true conservatism is. And, you know, generally I am for an America that seeks to fix itself. And as much as possible, again, it's never 100% possible given American power around the world, that we, essentially focus on ourselves and get out of all of these attempts to change other countries. Now that sounds very idyllic, but there are many Americans like me that understand that it's been catastrophe after catastrophe. I mean, what we did pulling out of Afghanistan after all of the hope that we gave to people, the many people who died who thought that the Americans were coming as saviors and they were there to stay and we would fix things. And then the utter brutality of when we left those allies who had worked with us dying. I mean, this is just one example, but
or Iraq, or Libya, or Syria, whichever.
Yeah, we're talking, especially as Christians, about real just death and destruction. And you know, on one level, it starts to not matter much, you know, where it came from, whether it came from misguided policies. And I do think, again, it's easy to say, well, it's just a group of people at the top that want money, or it's just an ideology of destruction, or I think it's a mix of things. But one of the things that really allowed it to occur was a profound misunderstanding of both human nature and of what a good foreign policy is. And I do believe that there were many people who called themselves as conservatives who were not necessarily evil people, but had such a fundamental misunderstanding of what democracy is, of what it means to allow people to choose their own paths, and just such arrogance that we were going to transform the world into a bunch of little Americas and disregard all of the things that make different people unique. That has been, in my view, one of the largest engines of this. Now, there are other engines, but I wouldn't discount it, because I know many good people. You know, I don't live in Washington, D.C., but I work in Washington, D.C., intentionally. But I know many good people in Washington, D.C. that, by good people, I mean they're trying to live good lives, they're trying to go to church, and I talk to them about American foreign policy, and we couldn't be at more different sides of the spectrum. So that has continued to allow America to go in the direction it's going. Again, I have hope, because Trump formalized something that has existed within the Republican Party and conservatism for a long time. You know, Pat Buchanan was one of the first presidential candidates who said, let's get our troops home, let's stay out of these foreign wars, let's stop it. That was always there, but it never had really had someone gain the presidency before. And again, while Trump was not perfect, we did have a short window in which at least we had someone articulating a different vision, wanting to end these wars, use prudence. But having said all that, are there people that would be willing to sacrifice Georgia for their own ends in America? Of course. You ask people where Georgia is, as you know, they
Best case, they'll find Atlanta.
Yeah.
My beloved Emory University.
So,
best case,
but
5 out of 10.
And this is the saddest part, that lack of knowledge, along with willful, those that willfully move in the direction of destruction. Those things combined together have given us a world where what you're saying is an unfortunate reality, where there's no sense, there's no thought given to the fact that you're in this unique position with countries all around you, and one, you know, and part of your territory, you know, is in someone else's hands, and that you need to be prudent, and you need to be careful, and you need to not be dominated by anyone. And this is what we should seek for all nations, that you're not dominated by Russia, but you're also not dominated by the United States and the EU, that other countries seek the same thing. And I think that, again, my focus is on family and life, but this goes hand in hand, because once you start meeting people around the world, like I've met you and met others, you start to understand more that each region has its own beauty, its own uniqueness, each people, and that there's true self-determination. I mean, they use these terms all the time. When it supports them, they say, well, this is self-determination. When it doesn't support them, they say territorial integrity. These are just two words that are used to depending on who they like and who they don't. There's no consistency. So we need to be consistent, and true self-determination it means that no great power gets to decide. No great power should be able to decide for a smaller power, and unfortunately, that's not the world we're in right now.
Let me empty my quiver and shoot the last arrow and give you more space to flip the table around. I guess my last question would be, you always, given your unbreakable spirit and enthusiasm, you always, but especially in the last couple of years, speak about the hope and the coming back of normality and pushing back on this inhuman, undescribable woke agenda which mutilates children and really tarnishes them. Aside from the tendencies on the Republican revanche and return of Trump or whomever, what else do you see that gives you that hope? Is there a grassroots sort of set of symptoms that are invisible for guys like us from outside, inside US? Is it in the air somehow? What's doing it? Is it the internet, which is really helping the true democratic stream? What gives you, let's call it, a scientific basis for being hopeful?
Well, there are multiple fronts. On the political front, I've always thought that we needed examples, shining cities on a hill. We need nations that are not capitulating to the liberal agenda. And so over the course of the last few years, we've seen Hungary move in a direction where the government is forcefully defending marriage as the union of a man and a woman. It's taking part of its GDP, a significant part of its GDP, far more than the United States ever has, to support families and family formation. We also have now Italy, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's speech that most Americans know her for, and I'm not bragging here, it's just real, is the YouTube video of her at the Verona World Congress of Families.
Where we were together and I spoke there too.
So, I mean, the fact that you hold one of these World Congress of Families and one of the speakers, you have no idea, ends up being Prime Minister of a country and has been good on these issues.
And I know, excuse my interrupting, you as an American are not allowed to speak freely, but with Putin doing just all of that, why is not Russia in that countdown?
Well, obviously, with where we're at right now in the United States, part of this use of the state, the power of the state, is that anyone that questions anything regarding Russia, even if you're critical of what Russia does in certain areas, but you also say that standing for life and family is great, immense pressure is brought to bear on people. And, we've seen...
so no freedom of speech?
No. I mean, I'm willing to say it. Of course, that anytime... They don't get a construct.
That always shocks me, because I always see Americans debating and defending even globalist position on Russian talk shows. And I have yet to see a single Russian in any American talk shows invited to defend.
This has now become a point at which you're not allowed to debate anymore. So that definitely is the case. But it's silly. Any country, from China to Russia, to Ukraine, any country, if they have policies that are good, you should point to that. If they're going in a direction that's good, even if you disagree with other policies, it's just childish. It's kindergarten. It's totally illogical to say, well, you're only allowed to say nice things about the countries that do almost everything you like one way. I mean, it's just absurd, but that's where we're at. So, Russia opposing a lot of the LGBT agenda, but there are other countries, and again, they may fundamentally disagree. Poland, and so these countries. Poland has done a good job on marriage and family and life, but even though these countries geopolitically have very different positions, what you do see is that you're now having states stand up in ways that they didn't before. So that gives me hope. of course, we care about the people, we care about the grassroots, we care about the day-to-day, but you also have to have political power in order to turn back much of what the liberals have done. You're not just going to be able to do this through culture. Culture is important, movies are important, entertainment's important. So the second thing is entertainment. Again, I don't believe that politics is somehow we're wasting our time. It's critical because it's the exercise of power. And unless we have some ability to exercise power, we're not going to be able to correct some of these great evils. Secondly, with culture and entertainment, we see the Sound of Freedom movie, where this movie that talks about human trafficking and the horrible evils of human trafficking, and which is often discounted in the media. People say, no, that's not really occurring, you're over. So many people went to see this movie, and it I think got nearly as much as these movies like Mission Impossible and Indiana Jones. It had higher sales, and this small studio, the small distributor, Angel Studios, which is very Christian, is the one pushing this. Another movie, Nefarious, did well. You have all of these much more conservative or Christian movies. You know, started with The Passion of the Christ, doing well. People are seeking out something else, even in the level of culture and entertainment.
Yeah, I remember attending at your invitation in Hollywood the prize ceremony for Christian movies held by our friend.
And Movie Guide, I think. Yeah.
It was quite impressive. So, yeah.
And finally, when it comes to faith, there are the movement of secularism, the rise of the people who say that they're none. We call them nuns in the United. You have the census. You're asked what your religion is. People say none, and there's been a huge rise of people who say nuns. But really, a lot of those people were just culturally attached to Christianity in the past, and they didn't want to tell the census workers that they don't believe in anything. Now, unfortunately, people are willing to do that, but at the same time, the sort of alienation and aimlessness and lack of purpose that our world has created, people are rejecting. And you're seeing people that are young coming back to Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism. So that's the view in the United States. I'd love to hear what you think about Georgia and whether the circumstances, especially on faith and the ability to turn, to stand up and fight back against liberalism, where you're at here.
I think we've been blessed with a historical figure, which is our patriarch. It has been proven that throughout the history of not only Georgian Orthodox Church, but all Orthodox churches, there has been no other patriarch who served in this capacity for that long. He has been enthroned in 1977. And last year, on December 25th, we celebrated 45th anniversary of his patriarchy. And on January 4th, we celebrated his 90th birthday. Let alone, I mean, it's one thing to just speak of the longevity of the service, but on the other hand, it's obvious and vivid that no other patriarch in the history of Christianity has brought the church from its almost utter and total destruction. Because when he became a patriarch in 77, Georgia only had 4 bishops and 12 priests, and I think 4 acting churches. From that to the level where it is at now. And all of this is connected to this exceptional holy man who is an example of humbleness, humility, and patience. And so that 45-year period, which is slightly more than my age, coincides with a total degrading and destruction of Georgian nation on every other front. When I was much younger, when Soviet Union collapsed, Georgia had 5.4 million people. It now has only 3.5 million people. And United Nations Population Foundation issued a new yet warning whereby if nothing changes by 2100, it will only be 1.4 million people in Georgia. So on one hand you have this pure, clean, holy, powerful stream of resurrection of Christianity. And on the other hand, you have the horrible post-Soviet 30 years of liberal republic with casinos, gambling, sexual propaganda, narcotics, basically eliminating the nation. So these are two giant forces, angelic and demonic, fighting for the body of the Georgian nation. Those who are trying to be on the divine side have many kids irrespective of their social and material status. Their divorce rates are much lower. The number of their family members who fall victim to narcotics, gambling, sexual perversion is much lower than those who are nuns and who think they can roam freely. They get, the radiation affects them much more so and exterminates them much more so. So in this sort of proud, cynical state of looking at Georgian church and its patriarch as something old-fashioned, retrograde, and underdeveloped. We know better. We are going towards NATO and Western secular models. These people are being incinerated. And so this is one vivid and clear major trend. So two anti-trends battling over the national body. If you delve a bit deeper and look into the newest history of Georgian church under the patriarch, I would separate three main historical periods or stratas. One is the inception, the enthroning of the patriarch, his service, his fighting against the communist ideology, his sort of bringing the nation out into independence, and an enormous rise of the authority and importance of Georgian church. Influx of you go to churches in Tbilisi on Sunday, they're full with young people. And then somewhere in the around early 2000s, when the Soros-funded Rose Revolution happens and Saakashvili's government comes in, and quite frankly, I don't see much difference in that regard with Georgian Dream. So let's say the liberal politics. What do? They see Patriarch and Georgian Church as their main opponent in terms of the influence on people. And they bombard the church from without and within non-stop. And that had its detrimental effects. For example, as it always happens, as you know, in the history of Eastern or Western church, when the church rises in importance, it gets joined by the clerics who are not in there for the Holy Spirit, but for the career, who are Pharisees and two-faced, and who do horrible things that harm the reputation of the church. And you've seen this in your congregation for decades now. Now, thankfully, the percentage of that sort of misbehaving, sometimes on purpose to discredit the church, agents, anti-Christian agents inside church, that percentage in Georgian church, I'm hoping is much lower than what we've seen in the Western church, but it's still there, and it has had its detrimental effect on churchgoers. We all know, I know, and many people around me know, many people who have stopped going to the church as a result of this negative image. I would contain it to single-digit percentage numbers. And then the third strata, the newest, is circumventing and stepping over that no matter what, and Patriarch's authority just carrying through this attack. I think we're in that period in the last couple of years now when Patriarch is very frail, his mind is 100%, and but his body is weak. And the people who watch this holy man saying, okay, he may have had some bad apples in the bunch, join the church, but look at this man and look at his life. And look at the people who are loyal to the church. They are so vividly more decent than others. And I would call this the second Renaissance, which we are in right now, which fills my heart with hope. But, you know, long live our patriarch, obviously. Sometimes we Georgians get very depressed when they imagine, we cannot even imagine ourselves without him, but the Christian faith tells us that the God who gave us this patriarch will give us our next patriarch, right? And so to summarize this in brief, Georgia is extremely blessed because in this onslaught of toxic liberal atheism and anti-Christian ideology, we are actually, if anyone had a father throughout these years who shielded them, gave them the direction, it's us. Yeah? It's not just us, obviously, but we're very happy to be living as contemporaries of a major authority. And I think the impact of this historical person, you know, centuries can come and go and nothing similar happens in the life of a nation. So the impact and the fruits of this historical person are to be analyzed and discussed in decades to come. But we live in a very happy place.
Well, and I was blessed when we had the World Congress of Families here in Tbilisi that your patriarch attended, and that was a big blessing.
Absolutely.
So what's the future look like?
Worrisome, but with hope. They're going to try to blow up Georgia. We have elections coming up. Democratic institutions are completely castrated. We've moved from presidential republic to parliamentary model, and under the auspices and guidance of Strasbourg and Brussels, we've abolished the last sort of parodies of democracy, so our MPs can no longer run on the basis of public support. They have to be part of a party list. And the right of referendums has been appropriated from the nation.
So no more referendum?
No, you can have it in theory. Like when they were trying to build this huge dam, which the population was against in western Georgia, and we had huge rallies throughout the country, including Tbilisi. I and two of our supporters gathered the legal case and the signatures and went to the authorities to register the request for the right of referendum, but we never got it. So in the name of democracy, Georgians are stripped of all the last hopes of democracy. It's extremely worrisome that in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we have seen sharp, violent escalation of a military conflict with our closest two neighbors. So Armenia and Azerbaijan are at war again. And Turkey is in on it from the Azeri side. And Armenians are sort of tilting away from their traditional pro-Russian course into a pro-Western course. And in response to that, Russians are letting Azeris have their way with the Armenians. And the tensions are extremely rising. And if we had those democratic channels of letting people's will out, I'd be more calm. But I feel like they've sealed off the boiling pot with no way for the energy to get out. And this boiling pot is sitting in now the fire of regional conflict. And so I'm very worried. In terms of the political calendar, we're a year plus away from the main event of Georgian political calendar, which is parliamentary elections. And the US Embassy backed ultra-liberal, woke, cynical, former Saakashvili-related coalition has no chance of snowball in hell to win by democratic vote. And this spineless, compromising majority of Georgian Dream, which quite frankly I never understood why was it not accepted as their own son of a bitch by the globalists, because they did everything they asked them. They passed the anti-discrimination law, they promoted gambling and casinos, they legalized, decriminalized light narcotics, and Georgia is drowning in narcotics. So they're like, they have the right to be upset at the globalists, because they're saying, we did everything you wanted us to. What's wrong with us? Yeah? And so you have this mainstream dominated by both liberals and this proclaimed ridiculous goal of the country, which is inscribed in the latest version of the Constitution, which is a candidate for a garbage can, because in the Georgian Constitution, in its later version, they've written that we must enter European Union and Euro-Atlantic Organization. I think we have the only constitution in the world which has nonsense like it written in it. What do you do if constitution is supposed to be something eternal, that it doesn't, can change it, but it's much more stable than contemporary political sort of orientations and alliances? What do you do with this constitution if European Union falls apart? Do you stop to exist as a state? It's nonsense. And so we have all the elements for a major bomb to go off. And what do we counter that with? Well, three things. One is the patriarch and the church and his prayers. Second is an accumulated experience of a tarnished nation which has been cheated and lied to so many times that we're hoping there is some element of wisdom now in our populace, and it's harder to manipulate. And the third hope is that maybe it's a very pale hope, very thin hope, but it's back to one of the questions I asked you. And the hope is that if the globalists want to keep Georgia, if the American embassy wants to remain open and operating in Tbilisi, they shouldn't ignite the place. It's counter to their interests. And I know you said in your response to me, but don't count on their logic. And I fully agree to that. But I'm still hoping that, why ignite a place if you want to keep your interests in Caucasus? So.
Yeah. Well, we're together and hoping that that's the case. But I like you, have opened my eyes up to the fact that illogic often dominates these sorts of questions. So I hope it's not the case. But, I think that just following on what you said, I think that, when first of all, as you know, very few Americans know what's going on in Georgia. So that's the number. I think I try and keep up, but I can't really comment on much other than I would say that when you asked about a Georgian dream, and again, I could be totally wrong on this, just looking from the outside, that there were a number issues with Georgian Dream in your government. For example, Saakashvili staying in prison. And then there was this issue with this politician who'd done something wrong, and they went and they got him. I don't remember, it was a few years ago. So these very small, maybe small things make it look, when you're looking from the outside, the Georgian Dream is more willing to stand up for Georgia and not willing to do everything. And again, I don't know if this is true or not, but that's what it appears.
I'd subscribe to that. And it's not good enough.
And that's my, usually, it seems to me that we're now at a point where unless there is total and utter capitulation, unless you, as a political party, do everything that you're asked, if there's someone else that they can get, they'll push to displace you immediately. And the loyalty, when you said that they're looking up saying we did everything, there is no loyalty. It is the worst thing that I see is the quest for utter domination, the idea that unless you do it our way, we're going to overrun you. And this is what has to be broken.
Yes, and that's the world in breaking now, in the war in Ukraine and the inception or the emergence of the multipolar world. And I don't know how to thank you for your visit and for your time. I know how Georgians respect you and love you for your position towards our traditional values. And every time I mention your name to people who know who is who, they just start smiling and saying, oh, Bryan is our brother. And I said in my introduction of you that it's my dream that you become one day U.S. ambassador to Tbilisi, although you have much bigger and important things to do. And let me extend mine and Nino's best wishes to Susan and the children, and hope that we can do this again sometime.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.